as Lana is the clerk of the Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is the peace and justice arm of the Quakers, she is one of our, I would consider anyway, a weighty Quaker. And when Kairos reached out to the Canadian Friends Service Committee for a representative of Quakers to join their religious delegation going to Palestine, it seemed very natural that Lana would be delegated to go. And as a bonus, also Lana has worked for Kairos for 4 or 5 years. So I would like to welcome my very good small f and capital F friend. Please welcome her.
What I am going to speak to you about is this amazing educational delegation to Palestine and Israel. I'm going to talk about why we went, what we saw, what we heard, and what I learned personally. And I'd like to start with a little bit of a story, and that is, it occurred after I got back, as a matter of fact. I had gone, upon my return in late November, to a small Middle Eastern market that's in Nanaimo now, and run by a lovely man from Oman. And I was in there and I was buying Christmas gifts for people, things from Palestine, and very excitedly went after his olive bar, and was filling my cup with Palestinian olives, which I'd come to develop quite a taste for while I was there. And the gentleman came around the corner while I was taking the last of the Palestinian olives, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, those are Palestinian olives." And I said, "Yes, I know, I was just there." And he looked at me very intently and he said, "What were you doing there?" And of course, I got a little nervous, and with measured words, I said that I had gone as part of a delegation to see what life was like for the Palestinian people under the occupation. And he looked at me, and I'm going to get emotional here, he looked at me and all he said was, "God bless you. Can I give you a hug?" And in that moment, I managed to hold it together until I got out into my car, and then, of course, went into a little weep session, because at that moment, I clearly understood and was brought face to face in a very personal way about why it was that we went and what that meant to people who live in that area of the world. I hadn't really understood in that really full and personal way what that was all about. So it has further dedicated me to my responsibility and obligation, as well as my pleasure and joy in sharing the stories of our experience and the people from that area. So I'm going to try the technology here and hope it works. Oh yes, there we are. So as I said, the delegation was comprised of members, church members from Kairos, Presbyterian, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the United Church, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Bishops' Orders, as well as the Quakers and Kairos staff. So we were a very diverse group of folks, and we bonded very quickly. As the first few days went by, we found ourselves immersed in a deeply personal and collective experience, which I've come to understand in different ways since returning. The purpose of the trip, as I said, was to come and see. And we were funded partly through our member churches, as well as through funds that Kairos was able to access through the Canadian government around women, peace, and security. And all of us made a commitment to share our stories when we got back. A number of the other delegates met last weekend in Ottawa with their members of parliament. They hosted breakfast so that they could share their story again with their MPs and hope to broaden the conversation at the national level around what the Canadian government should or could be doing to address the injustices that we saw and that they spoke to. Kairos did issue a report. It can be found on their website, and again, that resource will be listed at the, one of the slides at the end of my talk. We were hosted in the WIAM Center, the Palestinian Center for Conflict Transformation. And that organization does a number of things. One of the things that they sort of suggested that we look at were the inequalities that exist between the folks living in the West Bank and the occupied territories and those who enjoy different kinds of freedoms in Israel proper. So we were encouraged by them to take that into account, and it became the lens through which we came to see a lot of things. They're situated very close to the wall, the occupation, what do they call it, the security wall, and their offices are right there in Bethlehem. They do different things at WIAM besides hosting educational and cultural tours. They do women's and youth and children's programs. They provide trauma coping skills, and it was said by Zubi, our host, that there's no post-traumatic stress. It is ongoing traumatic stress. It never really leaves. They also engage in job creation programs, whether it's these beautiful embroidered things, and I saw somebody else in with a lovely shawl as well. They do jewelry making and provide economic opportunities for some of the people living in the area. They also provide peer mediation and meditation, which they find to be beneficial for people who are coping with that kind of stress. So as I said, they're located close to the occupation wall. They're also located a stone's throw from one of the refugee camps in Bethlehem. And this was one of the first things that we did on our first day was to walk through the refugee camps. There are two of them within walking distance from where we were, and we, I can't say explored because we didn't. We walked through, and most of us were overwhelmed, shocked, saddened, bewildered, and appalled by what we saw. The gateway you see here is very emblematic of the way people were forced to leave their homes when they were expelled. Many of them took with them the keys to their homes, believing that they would someday come home to those homes. And so this big key in front of the gates you see here is symbolic of that. Hope to return to their homes. The refugee camps, there are 58 of them in that UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, manages. And Palestinian refugees are defined as persons whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period between June 1946 and May of 1948, and who lost both home and livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. The services that UNRWA provides are available to all of those people living in that area of operations who meet that definition, and who are registered with the agency, which is another thing altogether, and who need assistance. The descendants of Palestinian refugee males, including adopted children, are also available or eligible for registration under those programs. When the agency began operations in 1950, it was responding to the needs of about 750,000 Palestinians. Today, there are some 5 million Palestinian refugees who are eligible for those services. So one of the things I want to point out here, this was one of the camps that we walked through. And as you're reading the slide there, I'd like to point out the population density. It was one of the things that really struck us about these camps. So by comparison, Canadian population density in our country is about 4 people per square kilometer on a national level. Victoria is the 7th most densely populated city in Canada at 4,400 people per square kilometer. The population density in Jerusalem is 7,200 people per square kilometer. These refugee camps that you're looking at here don't even cover a square kilometer. So Aida camp and the Daisha camp. So these two camps we focused on because they were within walking distance and they were the ones that we spent time in. As you can see by the information up there, this one is even more crowded. UNRWA does provide some healthcare services as well as some educational services. But you can imagine how crowded these would be and how difficult to access. One of the other things that we experienced there, because we did a lot of traveling in and out of Bethlehem, was a restricted movement of the Palestinian people in and out of the occupied territories. One of the things that we went through was Checkpoint 300. And Checkpoint 300, you can see here in the slide, is much used. It's often closed. There are particular announcements that will come over. Our driver was able to keep tabs on whether the checkpoint was going to be open or not. Often when we went to go through a checkpoint in the bus, I found it first kind of amusing and then sad and curious that they would, the bus driver would often invite me to come and sit in the front seat of the bus with him. And I wasn't really sure why at the beginning I was invited to do that. And it became obvious to me after the 3rd or 4th time that I am very white and very blonde, and the driver was not. And basically I was instructed kindly to just smile and wave at the guards on our way through the checkpoint. The guards at the checkpoint were both male and female, and many of them younger than my youngest son of 23. And they were armed and able to change the course of our day or anyone's day in a moment's notice. One of the things that we did one morning was to walk through the checkpoint. 3 or 4 of us took our paperwork and decided that this is what we were going to do. I can only describe it as inhumane and deeply undignified of the human condition. There weren't very many people there when we came through. We were sort of funneled through almost like a cattle feed. I don't know how else to describe it. And when we got to the front of the line, and of course there are several lines, people coming from different places. This is after going through the metal detector and through a number of turnstiles one at a time. When the guards saw us at the front of the line, they halted all of the other people trying to get through the line on their way to work, on their way to medical appointments, on their way to school, wherever it was that they were going. They were made to stop while they pulled us through. And if you've ever felt deeply disturbed about what privilege you might carry, that was one of those moments. I cannot imagine how it is for people to line up every morning hours before they need to start a job or get to an appointment or even just go meet up with a friend and be subject to the kinds of processes and processing that these people go through. The whim of the guard at the gate is what is going to determine whether or not you get to work. Imagine working somewhere in Greater Victoria or even Saanich and having to line up 4 or 5 hours before your job starts, and then not being sure whether you're going to be detained for hours, arrested, or turned around and sent back, or let through with nothing but a passing glance. That kind of built-in insecurity eats away at people, and people are living under these constant stresses. I can't imagine what that would be like on a daily basis. So, our first day, out in the world. We went to a number of villages. We went to Thabra, which is a village outside of Bethlehem. We drove for quite some time. On the way there, our guide Lucy says to us, she says, okay, pay attention here. Here's the clinic. And now pay attention to how much is in between here and the time we get to the village. So we waited and drove and waited and drove and saw very little. Not much for housing, no public transportation, very little traffic. We probably drove for another 10 or 15 minutes up into the hillside to this village of Thabra. And then what we were told when we got there was, remember the clinic back there? That's where everybody has to go to be taken care of medically. That's as far as they have to go, and most of them will have to walk. So when in Thabra, we visited with a women's group. These women had a place to meet. They had managed to find funding to build a space to gather. And in that space to gather, they learned about their rights under the international declarations around the Convention on Violence Against Women, Elimination of Violence Against Women. They learned about how to run for local and municipal governments so that they could sit on town councils. They gathered themselves together with their children. There must have been 35 women there. They took advantage of economic opportunities around baking. They made these incredible breads. They hosted us beautifully. One of the things that they did decide for themselves was that garbage collection was a major concern. They could see how the lack of garbage collection from the council, the local council, was affecting and impacting the health of themselves and their children. So they banded together and pressured the local government to establish garbage pickup. And so these women have managed to educate themselves, gather themselves, and then press for change. We were deeply inspired by them. They were lovely to speak with. We heard each of their stories. One of them, which you can't really see in the picture, there was a very, very young girl in a stroller, and her mother introduced her as a 6-year-old. The girl wasn't more than the size of a 2-year-old. And we found out later that she had kidney failure. And of course, this weighs on you when you saw how far the clinic was. And as you'll hear, it weighed on us further when we went to visit a hospital. But we'll just leave her for now. We went to another village called Beit Umar and met with another women's group there. One of the women from WIAM Center, her name is Lucy Talglish. She's the one that goes out and runs all of these women's groups that we were able to visit with. In Beit Umar, we heard from the women about the challenges they face with adequate employment, getting to and from work. Many of them choose to work in the settlements and in Jerusalem because the pay is often quite a bit higher than they would manage in the occupied territory where they are. There is a certain indignity in working as a domestic for someone you often will see as an oppressor, and they spoke to that. They also spoke to the challenges they face in a patriarchal society, becoming the sole breadwinners in their communities for their families because their male children and often their husbands are they've either been killed or they're incarcerated. One woman spoke to us of 5 sons, all in jail. And she has now had to find economic opportunities to feed the rest of her children and support the people around her who are also suffering. They were a lovely group of women, and basket weaving was something that they had started doing, and many of them did this beautiful embroidery that's very traditional for that area. So they again are trying to educate themselves and provide opportunities for themselves and take what opportunities they can in ways to support themselves. The other place we visited, another women's group, was in Jericho. This was an amazing experience because this group of women had started a restaurant. They had used that, their cooking skills, producing traditional meals for the local communities as an economic opportunity. And of course, they feasted us while we were there and spoke to us of the life there. And I couldn't help but think about the time I had looked to take a culinary vacation and saw that there is a demand for people to go and experience cultural exchanges and do these kind of culinary adventures. So I'll let you know when that's in place, and we can all explore that in Jericho together. The women were lovely and hospitable. One of them said to us, you know, as we were sitting around the table drinking and eating and laughing together, she said, "You see us sitting here having fun, you hear us laughing, but we are choking. The very air we breathe and the water we drink is controlled by other people. We want to be free." And she only expressed an interest in going to the sea to be able to swim. And that's something that we take for granted here, and yet so many people have grown up in this region close to the ocean and have never been able to get there. We also visited the Augusta Victoria Hospital, which was a project partially funded by the World Lutheran Church. And one of the things that we found out there is that medical care for Palestinian people in the occupied territories is hard to come by. And there are very specialized services that are almost impossible to access. One of those things is dialysis. And this particular hospital hosts practically the only available oncology treatment for Palestinians, adults and children, as well as dialysis machines for children. They also are the only ones available to Palestinians looking for palliative care. This was all, we were given a tour of the hospital, state of the art. It's been well funded by the Canadian government and by the Lutheran Church. And one of the things that they told us was they have an outreach program which takes medical care out into communities that are very hard to get to and doubly hard for the local residents to come into. And when we heard this, you could see the looks around the room, all of us thinking about the little girl that we'd seen in Thabra, thinking, wow, what if we could put the outreach group in touch with the mother of a young girl in this community? And so as we were walking the hallways, we were talking amongst ourselves, and all of a sudden we came around the corner, and I get really emotional here. There is the little girl from Thabra with her mother. And it wasn't the mother that recognized us, it was the little girl we heard poking at her mother saying, "Look, look." And so there they had come around the corner of this hospital and were obviously being cared for and treated at the hospital. And of course, this was a clear indication to us that there are things that are hopeful and are working, however many more of them there are to be. One of the other shocking things that we found out at our tour of the hospital is that because this hospital is located in Jerusalem, if you are a parent of a child needing medical services at this particular hospital, and you're under the age of 35 years old, you will be denied a permit to accompany your child for treatment. And I, as a parent, have a hard time imagining sending my children away for care as a young mother might feel. And many of the mothers are young because they marry quite young in that area for any number of reasons. So that was our visit at the hospital, which both came with sort of shock and hope. The right to water. Over time, we did visit a water cistern project and a road project that was to help farmers access markets. Palestinians over time have seen their access to water reduced by about 20% since Oslo II to 2010. They've been able to access what was 118 million cubic meters per year, which was promised in the Oslo Accords. That now amounts to 98 million cubic meters per year. So it is a decrease of about 20%. In the same period of time, the number of Israeli settlers in the occupied territories who are now accessing water has risen to more than 500,000. They now consume 6 times more water that's been allocated for domestic purposes to 2.6 million Palestinians in the West Bank. One of the things that we noticed while we were driving around in the various areas was the irrigation of the boulevards in Jerusalem and the water cisterns on the roofs of the Palestinians in the same area. The extraction of water and the diversion of it amounts to about 89% of the water resources available in that region, which have now been allocated to those residing in Israel and the settlements. As a result, the Palestinians are forced to rely on Israel's national water company for their water. It meets at least a third of their domestic needs, and has made that company the largest supplier of water in the West Bank. So there's a real inequality around water. The permits for Palestinians to dig wells are almost non-existent. They're rarely given. And even when they are, they're only allowed to dig so deep. They can't dig deep wells, so farmers and agriculture in the occupied territories and for the Palestinians has suffered greatly because of that. This was the road project that was going to bring access to markets to about 80 farmers in the area. It was a very short stretch of road, and it was funded by an international body. We also found out that any water projects that are built without a permit, which is also very hard to get, can be destroyed no matter who the donors and how it's funded, just at the whim of the Israeli government. We visited a number of both Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations and social justice organizations. One of the ones that really struck us was what we were told from the Defense for Children International. Coming back, this is where we all agreed that in order to change things, there has to be a place to start. And we felt that this would be the thin edge of the wedge in terms of what everybody can agree on is how we treat children. Every year, approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children, and some as young as 12 years old, are detained and prosecuted in the Israeli military court system. Palestinian children are not dealt with law enforcement through a civil law enforcement agency. Everybody gets dealt with through a military court. The most common charge is stone throwing, so throwing projectiles. As you can see, we're sitting around the table there. This wall, where you see all these names, this was at the gateway where we showed you the key, and these are the list of children that have been killed, and they keep track. Up to this point in time, 2,115 children have been killed as a result of Israeli military and settler presence in the occupied territories since the beginning of the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000. So that's 19 years, 20 years of children dying. And that doesn't include children engaged in hostilities. So these would be what some might refer to callously as collateral damage. There was a lot to be said about how the children were treated, and the Defense for Children International keeps statistics. And so these statistics are according to testimonies from 739 Palestinian children that were detained by Israeli forces from the occupied West Bank and prosecuted in Israeli military courts between 2013 and 2018. And these are the statistics. So as you can see, I won't go over them because I'm pretty sure you can all read, the vast majority of these children have been put through ordeals that we here would believe that should only be, well, many of us would believe that they would never be used. They're not a humane way to treat people, much less children. I would encourage you to look at the No Way to Treat a Child campaign for further information and ways to talk about this particular issue. It's emotionally charged, and again, we decided that, just in conversation, that this should be a place that we can all agree these things should not be happening. Another one of the spaces we visited an organization called Zakrot. And they're a fascinating organization. They work to end the occupation and envision the right of return for all Palestinians. They're Israeli, which led us to ask a number of questions around the voices that are given weight in the social justice world. One of the things that they talked about was this map. They've developed an app, there is an app for that, that you can download onto your phone, and what it will do is show you all of the villages that have been destroyed, demolished, built over top of, basically disappeared. It allowed us to see, oh that's interesting, where these villages were, and if they pop up like little pinpoints on your Google Maps, and you can read more information about them, how many people lived there, what the demographic makeup of them was, when they were demolished or destroyed. And it was very sobering to look at this map and see how many of these villages no longer exist. It's something you can look up. It's called, if you go to their website, you can find that. We also visited with B'Tselem. They're also a human rights organization. They're an information center. And again, what we saw there were a lot of security for the staff people. One of the things that we noticed with Zakrot, with B'Tselem, with the Coalition of Women for Peace, when we visited them, the people who worked for them told us the stories of their personal lives as Israelis fighting for Palestinian justice. These people did this work at a great cost to themselves personally. They were often disowned by their families. Their friends no longer wanted to have anything to do with them. Their opportunities for employment became extremely limited to social justice work in the NGO sector. They are challenged as human rights workers in their own communities. And we found that they all spoke to the social isolation and the risks to their safety in doing the work that they do, but that they felt compelled to do this work. And again, there's a slide that has all of these resources listed. Sabeel was another one of these organizations that we visited. So part of our trip also involved visiting with a lot of religious leaders. We visited with imams, we visited with rabbis, we visited with a number of the ecumenical partners in that area. And when we spoke with them, the message was very, very clear, and they all had the same thing to say about how we engage with this kind of work and how our response needs to be. One of them said, and he put it very clearly, if you've come here to be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli, we don't need your friendship. This is not the response that is going to be useful. As a Quaker, my own understanding of a compassionate response to these injustices is to hold both the oppressors and the oppressed in as much compassion as we can find. They are imprisoned in their own ways, and if we cannot hold them largely and inclusively, we've also lost a sense of humanity ourselves. And there will be nothing to be gained by vilifying one and victimizing another in the dialogues, in the circles that we try to keep, in the voices that we try to listen to and come to understanding. That was my big understanding going in. It's the larger understanding I came away with. And I think that all of us were deeply moved to hear all of the religious leaders, all of the community activists echo that same sentiment. No matter what they were describing to us in terms of injustice and appalling conditions under the occupation, it all came down to the same thing, that our compassionate response has to be large enough to hold everyone. There are the sources and information. I'm happy to email that slide to anybody if they want to. Any of the names of those organizations can be easily looked up online. The bottom one there, the second to last one, is the website for the Kairos report. And that report's also fulsome in what it asks specifically of the Canadian government. I would encourage you to read it. It's entertaining in terms of the photographs and the stories that got told. It's also very informative in terms of speaking with your MPs and ways to bring up conversations with our politicians going forward. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.